Why do people often feel the happiest just before reaching happiness rather than when they fully attain it? In the journey of human life, there exists a haunting paradox. The deepest happiness we've ever felt often doesn't come from actually possessing what we longed for, but from the very moment we almost touch it. It's that moment when emotions swell, the heart races, and hope soars, when everything is still in the making, not yet fully formed, but overflowing with possibility. Especially in matters of love and relationships, the moments that move us most, that linger in our memories, are not when love is officially declared, but during those uncertain, ambiguous early days. It's the stolen glances, the text messages written and deleted, the accidental touches that send the mind spinning. It's those fleeting seconds when a simple nod or a smile can fill the heart with joy, because nothing is certain, and every possibility is still alive. It is precisely this ambiguous, undefined state that intoxicates and captivates us. In that stage of getting closer to happiness, the mind remains untouched by the weight of reality. Ideal visions stay intact, imagination is free to soar, and anticipation heightens the emotional value of every moment. This isn't merely a random emotional illusion. On the contrary, it reflects a fundamental mechanism in the nature of human desire. We crave not just because of the end goal, but because of the craving itself. What truly enthralls us is often the act of longing, that vivid, intense feeling of moving towards something not yet ours. From the perspective of psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan, human desire is never aimed at complete satisfaction. Instead, it always revolves around a sense of lack, what he calls objet, petit. We don't desire the object itself, but the feeling of desiring. More precisely, Lacan suggests that we desire the desire of others. We value something, in part because others see it as valuable, long for it, or regard it as worthy of pursuit. Therefore, happiness has never been an absolute or independent object. It is an illusion constructed through the eyes of others, through expectation, through the idealized projections we attach to it. We feel the happiest in the moment of almost reaching, because illusion is still intact. Reality hasn't intervened, and desire continues to be fueled by what remains just out of reach. Hello everyone, in today's video, I'd like to invite you on a journey of reflection, inspired by the philosophy of Jacques Lacan, as we explore a question that seems simple at first, but in fact carries profound layers of meaning. Why do we only feel truly happy when we're almost there, not when we've fully arrived? In Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory, one of the most influential psychoanalysts and philosophers of the 20th century, desire is not simply a natural instinct. It does not originate from a complete, autonomous, and self-governing ego, as is commonly misunderstood in popular conceptions. On the contrary, desire is a dynamic structure, a system that is formed and operates through language, within the symbolic order that every human being is compelled to enter upon becoming a part of society. Lacan argues that the subject is never a fully formed self, unlike the ideal ego proposed in Descartes' philosophy. I think, therefore I am. For Lacan, the subject is a fragmented being, one that constantly experiences lack and can only recognize itself through the gaze of the other, a gaze he famously refers to as l'égard. From early childhood, the infant begins to construct an image of the self, le moi, during what Lacan calls the mirror stage, when the child sees its reflection in a mirror and starts to identify with the image as a distinct self. But this is merely an illusion of unity. In reality, both the child and later the adult remain internally fragmented, always missing some part of themselves. And it is precisely this sense of incompleteness that becomes the driving force behind desire. Language, a product of what Lacan calls the symbolic order, is the tool through which we define ourselves and the world around us. Yet at the same time, it confines us within pre-existing frameworks of meaning. The moment the subject enters into language is also the moment it loses its original wholeness, and from that point on begins a lifelong quest to reclaim what has been lost, in the form of desire. From this perspective, happiness is no longer a natural state or an internal achievement of the individual. It is not something that can ever be fully attained. Rather, happiness is a byproduct of the structure of desire, something that is always named, idealized, and longed for. But the moment we believe we've grasped it, it vanishes like smoke. According to Lacan, human desire always aims toward what is absent, forever driven by lack, manque. Therefore, happiness, if it exists, is always ahead of us, forever in a state of being almost within reach, yet never truly in our possession. The metaphor of a mirage is fitting here. Happiness is like an illusion shimmering on the desert horizon. We move forward with the powerful belief that just one more step will bring us to cool, refreshing water. But as we draw near, the image recedes, and all that remains is the echo of a longing once felt. Let us return to one of Lacan's most famous and controversial declarations. Le désir est le désir de l'autre. Desire is the desire of the other. This statement carries many layers of meaning. On one level, it can be taken quite literally. We desire something because others desire it. For example, an object becomes valuable when others compete for it. But on a deeper level, Lacan is saying that what truly makes us desire something is not the object itself, but the way it reflects the gaze of the other, the way it is marked by someone else's desire. It is within the gaze of the other that we feel lovable, worthy of being desired. And from there, we begin to desire not because of the object's inherent nature, but because it is seen as valuable through the eyes of another. If happiness is not an absolute personal state, but rather a product of social structures shaped by language, symbolism, and the gaze, then the feeling of almost reaching happiness may be the last moment in which we still hold a complete illusion of it. Once reality enters the picture, once we finally obtain what we longed for, happiness risks being distorted, fractured, or dissolved altogether. First layer of meaning. Desire does not arise from within, but is shaped from the outside through the gaze of the other. In his initial interpretation of the famous phrase, "Desire is the desire of the other," Jacques Lacan presents a revolutionary argument. We do not inherently know what is worth desiring. Contrary to the common belief that desire stems from internal instinct arising from needs or the subject's own nature, Lacan contends that the object of desire is always mediated through the other. That is, it is filtered through the gaze, the recognition, and the symbolic order that the other represents. From early childhood, we learn to determine what is good, beautiful, or valuable, not through purely personal experience, but through the reactions, expressions, and words of those around us. A toy becomes more desirable not because of its intrinsic qualities, but because it is in the hands of another child. That child becomes the mediator who awakens our desire. This is the core principle behind the structure of mimetic desire, later developed in similar terms by René Girard. Lacan introduces the concept of the autre, the other, not merely as an individual person, but as a symbol of society, of linguistic order, of cultural norms, and of pre-established systems of value. It is through this other that we construct our internal map of desire. We do not desire an object because it holds absolute value, but because it has been assigned value through the gaze of the other. In other words, we don't truly want something for ourselves. We want it as if it has already been wanted by someone else. Desire becomes a loop of reflection, where the subject does not only crave the object, but also craves to be seen as a subject who desires something of value. What gives this interpretation its compelling power is Lacan's emphasis on the concept of recognition. Without recognition from the other, without validation through language or symbols, desire cannot be fully formed. What we call "I want X" is in reality a statement already shaped by the semiotic environment in which we were raised: the media, culture, family, friends, aesthetic, and moral norms. Lacan reveals that desire is not merely a subjective act, but a reaction that has been pre-programmed within the symbolic system we inhabit. We believe we are the ones steering desire, but in fact, we are being steered by the traces of others' desires embedded in the social fabric that surrounds us. Second layer of meaning. We do not merely desire the object we desire to become the object that others desire. If the first layer of Lacan's statement, le désir de l'autre, reveals that desire originates from the outside, the second layer unveils a deeper psychological and existential truth. What we truly long for is not just something external to us, but rather the image of ourselves as the object of someone else's desire. To put it more simply and directly, we desire to be desired. The most profound longing within us is to become the object of another's desire, to have our value affirmed through the desirous gaze of the other. This means that we don't only want to possess something, we want to be seen as worthy of being possessed. When someone loves us, admires us, or desires us, it is through their gaze that we perceive our own worth. We feel our existence validated. Thus, desire is no longer a one-way flow from subject to object, but a reciprocal loop where we not only want, but also want to be wanted. For Lacan, the gaze of the other, le regard de l'autre, holds near deterministic power over the subject's being. We define ourselves not through an isolated inner self, but through the way we are perceived, judged, or imagined by others. The ego, seemingly the starting point of desire, is in fact the result of a process of being shaped and given meaning by others. In real life, the manifestations of this layer are everywhere. A person works relentlessly not just to earn money, but to be recognized as competent in the eyes of colleagues. An artist creates not just to express themselves, but to be admired and understood by an audience. A lover desires not only their beloved, but the feeling of being the one who is loved. All of these behaviors converge on a shared core, the desire to appear in the gaze of the other as a meaningful, desirable presence. And thus, we continuously craft ourselves into images we believe will be desired, a largely unconscious, yet universal behavior. This second layer of meaning does not merely analyze a psychological structure. It also carries profound existential implications. We cannot assert the value of our existence in absolute terms without someone else bearing witness to it. In Lacan's thought, human existence is a form of waiting for recognition, an endless quest to be affirmed by the other as lovable, worthy of life, and desirable. This explains why so many people, even after achieving all conceivable external success, still feel empty in the absence of recognition from others. It is precisely from this second layer, where the human being longs to become the object of desire, that Jacques Lacan constructs a foundational structure of modern psychoanalysis. The constant tension between the subject and the other, between the fractured self and the powerful gaze that defines it. Within this structure, desire is no longer a spontaneous inward act driven purely by reason or instinct. It functions like a revolving axis spinning around the reflections between the self and the external world, where we both shape and are shaped by the other. And within this mirror-like cycle, what we call happiness, once assumed to be a private feeling, emerges instead as a byproduct, a secondary effect of being seen, recognized, and desired. From here, we can begin to understand. Happiness is no longer a static destination, not the result of a personal journey toward inner completeness. Instead, it is the fragile moment just before the illusion collapses. It is when we stand at the very edge of what we desire, close enough to feel the euphoria of almost touching it, yet still distant enough for the fantasy to remain flawless. This is the peak moment of desire, when reality has not yet intruded, and the illusion still shimmers in the gaze of the other. In that moment, we are not truly happy because we have attained what we wanted, but because we are recognized as worthy of being desired, positioned at the center of someone else's gaze. It is in that gaze that we glimpse our own value being affirmed, and it is this, more than possession, that produces the feeling of happiness. Those who have followed my previous videos, particularly the one analyzing Hegel's master-slave dialectic, focused on the interplay between desire, recognition, and death, will clearly recognize the deep resonance between Lacan's thinking and the Hegelian philosophical tradition. It is no coincidence that Jacques Lacan was deeply influenced by Alexandre Kojève, the philosopher who famously reinterpreted Hegel's thought for the modern era in a legendary series of lectures in Paris during the 1930s, where Lacan himself was a regular attendee. In Hegel's master-slave dialectic, as developed in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the self cannot become fully conscious of itself without the recognition of the other, without a mirror in which to be reflected, to have its existence acknowledged. But to receive that recognition, the subject must enter into a life-or-death struggle, willing to risk everything, because only in confronting death can one transcend mere biological survival and assert the status of being fully human. Lacan not only inherits this structure, but transposes it into the domain of the unconscious and the realm of language. While Hegel situates death as a metaphysical limit, Lacan reveals that the death of illusion, when the reflection offered by the other disintegrates, is the true limit of desire. While Hegel situates death as a metaphysical limit, Lacan reveals that the death of illusion, when the reflection offered by the other disintegrates, is the true limit of desire. And from this we realize the ultimate threshold of happiness does not lie in having, but in standing just beside the edge of being desired, that liminal space where we can still appear in the eyes of the other as a complete symbol, unblurred by the intrusion of reality. There is a profound paradox. We do not desire what we already have. We desire what has never been whole. When we approach happiness, for example, in the early stirrings of love or the brink of achieving a dream, that is when objet manifests in its most alluring form. It belongs to the imaginary realm, l'imaginaire, where the image has not yet been stripped bare by reality, where every imagined future still glows with promise. But the moment we believe we have captured what we longed for, when we love the person we dreamed of, or achieve the goal we pursued, objet collapses from the realm of fantasy and falls into the real. And what surprises us is this: reality never lives up to the idealized expectations we had constructed. Happiness then ceases to be a brilliant climax, and instead becomes the beginning of a repetitive cycle of habit, of dullness, of the everyday. This subtle condition is most vividly experienced in the ambiguous phase before a relationship is defined. When two people are not yet officially in love, but the glances grow longer, the messages become hesitant, and the heartbeat stumbles. The relationship is both near and distant, clear and uncertain, creating a gray zone rich in imagination, where every small moment becomes fertile ground for longing. This very uncertainty carries powerful allure. During this phase, we are allowed to dwell in a happiness not yet solidified, not yet constrained, where the delicate distance between two people generates a field of desire. It's not so close that reality can intervene and shatter the illusion, yet not so far that connection is lost. In that space, we do not possess love, and yet we are intoxicated precisely because we do not. Desire is stretched to its peak, but not yet extinguished by realization. It is the purest moment of emotion, like a melody still ringing, suspended before the final chord. From Lacan's perspective, it is distance, not total union, that sustains desire. And thus, if happiness exists at all, it does not lie in what we have, but in what we are about to have, what seems almost within reach, yet always preserves a small gap where imagination can still breathe. In such moments, objet A does not appear as a concrete object, but as a glimmer of light reflected from absence, the lingering echo of what is incomplete. It is what gives waiting its seductive power, what makes the unfulfilled so moving, and what turns the almost into the most emotionally charged experience of all. Perhaps the most vivid and relatable example of Lacan's entire structure of desire, fantasy, and lack is the ambiguous phase of a relationship that has yet to be defined. It is that moment when two people walk the delicate line between friendship and love, between subtle probing and emotional revelation, between closeness and the need for distance. In those fleeting moments when conversations feel casual but are heavy with hidden meaning, when glances meet and then quickly look away, or when gestures of affection no longer feel accidental, the structure of infinite approach comes alive in its most intense form. Desire does not erupt violently. Instead, it simmers, coils, and pulses through the tiniest details, in the pauses between words, in the unfinished reactions, in an atmosphere saturated with possibility and unspoken potential. Within this ambiguous dance, from internal questioning and reading between the lines, to intentionally keeping one's distance as a strategy, the objet petit is summoned and sustained as the gravitational center of attraction. The other person is no longer just an individual. They become a symbol of what is missing in the subject, a mirror reflecting the unfillable lack within. If happiness exists at all in this stage, it does not come from having each other, but from being immersed together in a shared fantasy structure where each person becomes the idealized image in the eyes of the other. In this space, the other is no longer simply themselves, but a symbol of the possibility of being loved, seen, and desired, an external projection of the internal longing within us. This is precisely why so many people experience overwhelming infatuation during this phase of ambiguity, only to feel a sudden drop, disappointment, or anticlimax the moment the other person breaks the spell with a clear declaration like, "Let's be together officially." At first glance, this seems like what we were waiting for, but at the unconscious level, this is the moment when the illusion begins to dissolve. What once shimmered in the ambiguity of fantasy in a space full of potential is now confined by a specific label, pinned down by the language of reality. What was once desirable because it was almost about to happen, possibly attainable, now becomes something already had. And as Lacan pointed out so sharply, the act of naming desire through language is the beginning of its destruction. Because language, once it defines, strips away the ambiguity, and it is precisely that ambiguity which nourishes desire. From a Lacanian perspective, the ambiguous phase of a relationship is not merely a stepping stone before love, it is the most radiant moment of desire. This is because everything still unfolds within the space of lack, reflection, and fantasy, a space where happiness has never yet been possessed, and thus has never been depleted. As long as the objet petit remains in the realm of the imaginary, l'imaginaire, we are free to fantasize, to idealize, and to feel fulfilled even without holding anything tangible. But once desire is named, defined, and solidified into an official relationship, the very distance that sustains desire vanishes, leaving behind direct contact with reality, where nothing remains as flawless as it did in our dreams. All of this leads us to a key realization. The peak of happiness is not found in finally grasping what we desire, but in the act of approaching it when it still exists as an unrealized image, an unbroken symbol, a shimmering illusion suspended in the imagination. However, this should not be mistaken as a dismissal of official relationships or long-term commitments. Quite the opposite, it reveals a deeper truth about the emotional structure of the human experience. Happiness does not arise from the relationship itself, but from the symbolic distance the relationship allows us to maintain a space where the illusion remains intact and the symbolic remains charged with possibility. According to Jacques Lacan, the human being is not simply a biological creature with needs and instincts. Rather, we are products of language of the symbolic order, where every word we speak both creates meaning and distances us from what we truly wish to say. It is in these gaps within the symbolic, the cracks that language cannot fill, that the human subject emerges as a being of lack, forever desiring, never fully satisfied. Unlike animals, who can satisfy their needs directly as they arise, humans experience the intensity of desire only in relation to others through the gaze, through language, and especially through unformed fantasies. What we think of as happiness is not a stable internal experience, but rather an echo from the other, reverberating toward us. It is the moment when we see ourselves reflected as a desirable presence just before reality dissolves the illusion. In this deepest sense, happiness is not something rooted in the present, not in what is happening, and certainly not in what has been attained. Happiness is an indirect state, a feeling that arises at the very edge of desire, a moment that seems about to become real, but hasn't quite taken shape. It is the resonance between distance and potential, between fantasy and reality, between the incomplete self and the gaze of the other, that makes us believe we might be made whole. And that, perhaps, is why we often feel the happiest, not when happiness is in our hands, but when it is still just ahead of us, unnamed, unclaimed, and still untarnished by reality. In conclusion, the statement, "Human beings are happiest when they are almost reaching happiness," is far from a casual or simple remark. On the contrary, it opens the door to a profound philosophical structure where the self, in Lacan's thought, is caught between two opposing poles, illusion and lack. We do not feel happiness because we have attained what we desire. Rather, it is precisely because happiness has not yet occurred, because the illusion has not yet been stripped away, and desire is still operating within an indirect structure that we experience the unique, unparalleled peak of that emotion. Happiness, therefore, is not a destination that can be grasped. It is a direction endlessly delayed, suspended between expectation and possibility. It exists in the fragile cracks between fantasy and reality, between the unsaid and the almost happening. And it is this paradoxical, dialectical structure that quietly repeats itself within human emotional life as inner tensions and contradictions that never fully resolve. Unrequited love, undefined relationships, or the approach toward an ideal, none of these offer final satisfaction, yet they are often the most vivid and unforgettable experiences of our lives. Why? Because they remain open-ended. Because they prolong the illusion rather than extinguish desire. Because they give us the feeling of almost touching something sacred, and in that almost, happiness flares up most intensely before dissolving like a flash of light. Happiness is not a result. Happiness is an unnamed possibility. Happiness is not found in possession. It exists in that moment, just before we touch it.